They say the swamp remembers every footstep and every crime. When Ilara and a handful of escaped slaves stumbled into Hollow Bend, broken, starving, hunted, they thought the worst was behind them. But the hunters followed fast, torches in hand, dogs howling, ready to drag them back in chains. What those hunters didn't know was that Hollow Bend had guardians. Two silent, towering brothers, Jonan and Yosu, men shaped by brutality, sharpened by survival, and feared by every plantation for miles. The night the hunters reached the marsh, the twins stepped out of the mist, moving like shadows, striking with a force no man could match. One swing of a giant arm, one growl in the dark, and the hunters ran. But humiliation breeds vengeance. When the hunters returned, with rifles, dogs, and the twins' former master leading the charge, Hollow Bend learned the truth. The giants weren't just protectors. They were the real prize, and everyone in that swamp was about to pay the price for their legend. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun pressed through the canopy like a fading promise. Ilara's feet had stopped hurting hours ago, which frightened her more than the pain had. Numbness meant the body was shutting down. She couldn't afford that. Not yet. "Mama," Micah whimpered from her back. His small arms hung loose around her neck. "Hush, now." Her voice came out barely louder than breath. "We're close." She didn't know if that was true. She hoped it was true. Hope was all she had left to carry. Behind her, old Grant stumbled over an exposed root. Soraya caught his elbow before he went down completely. The old man's face had turned gray, like ash left too long in a cold fire. His breathing rattled in his chest. Can't keep," he gasped. "You can," Nadine said firmly. She was younger than the rest, maybe 17, with hands scarred from cotton bowls and a jaw that never stopped clenching. "You don't get to stop now." A whistle cut through the trees, high and sharp. Everyone froze. Another whistle answered from the east, then a third from somewhere behind them. The sounds formed a triangle, tightening. "Dogs," Grant whispered. "They got dogs." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Micah's leg pressed against her spine, swollen and hot even through the thin cloth she'd wrapped it in. The bone had broken 3 days into their escape when he'd fallen from a wagon. She'd splinted it with branches and prayer, but infection was setting in. She could smell it. "How far to the swamp?" Soraya's voice shook. "Don't know," Ilara admitted. "Stories just said it was there, that people could hide there." "Stories?" Nadine spat the word. "We're running toward stories. Better than running toward nothing." Ilara shifted Micah's weight. "Better than staying where we were." Nadine's face softened slightly. They all knew what staying meant. Ilara had watched the overseer beat her husband until his skull cracked. Saria had been sold away from her children. Nadine had been promised to a man 3 times her age who liked his women quiet and broken. Old Grant had simply decided that dying free was better than dying in chains. They moved forward again, pushing through underbrush that tore at their clothes. Ilara's dress was barely recognizable, just strips of fabric hanging from her shoulders. Blood spotted the hem where thorns had cut her legs. The whistles grew closer. "There!" Grant pointed with a trembling finger. The trees ahead thinned out, revealing a wall of murky water and tangled vegetation. The air changed, became thick and wet. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. The smell of rot and growing things mixed together. "The swamp," Ilara breathed. Behind them, dogs began to bark. Not the confused barking of animals who'd lost a scent. This was the excited, vicious sound of dogs who'd found their prey. "Move!" Nadine pushed forward first, stepping into the water without hesitation. The swamp grabbed at her legs. Dark water rose to her knees, then her thighs. She gasped, but kept going. Soraya followed, then helped Grant wade in. The old man's face twisted with exhaustion and disgust as mud sucked at his feet. Ilara stood at the edge, looking down at the black water. Micah trembled against her back. "Mama, I'm scared." "I know, baby. I know." She stepped in. The water was cold despite the warm air. Things brushed against her legs. Plants or creatures, she couldn't tell. Micah whimpered as the water soaked through his makeshift splint. "Stay quiet now," she whispered. "Be brave for Mama." They moved deeper. The water rose to Ilara's waist. She had to hold Micah higher to keep his injured leg from dragging. Her arms screamed with the effort, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The dogs reached the swamp's edge. Their barking turned frantic, confused. Ilara heard men's voices shouting commands. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, following Nadine's dark shape through the growing darkness. Night fell fast in the swamp. One moment there was dim twilight. The next, there was only blackness broken by pale moonlight filtering through moss-covered trees. Strange sounds echoed around them. Splashes, croaks, rustling that could have been wind or could have been something else. "There," Soraya said. Her voice carried strange hope. "You see it?" A light flickered in the distance. Then another, small and yellow, like lantern flames. They moved toward the lights. Ilara's legs felt like lead. Water filled her shoes and made every step a battle. Micah had gone silent on her back, which worried her more than his crying had. A figure appeared ahead, blocking their path. Ilara's heart seized. "Who's there?" The voice was female, cautious, but not hostile. "Please," Ilara managed. "We're running. We need help." The figure moved closer, lantern raised. Light revealed a woman maybe 40 years old, with strong shoulders and eyes that had seen too much. She studied them carefully. "You alone?" "Hunters behind us," Grant said. "They got dogs." The woman, Mara, she'd later introduce herself, nodded once. "Follow me. Quick now." She led them through a winding path that only she seemed to see. They emerged into a clearing where crude huts stood on raised platforms above the water. Other people moved between the structures, faces turning to watch the newcomers with mixed expressions of sympathy and fear. Mara brought them to an empty hut. "Get inside. I'll bring food." Ilara climbed onto the platform and finally set Micah down. The boy's face was pale and slick with sweat. She touched his forehead. Burning hot. Mara returned with cornmeal mush and water. It wasn't much, but Ilara's hands shook as she fed Micah small bites. The others ate in silence, too exhausted for words. Outside, the settlement grew quiet as full night settled. Ilara managed to get Micah to drink some water. He lay on a rough blanket, shivering despite the warmth. She stroked his face and hummed softly, an old song her own mother had sung. Then the dogs barked again, closer this time, much closer. People emerged from huts, gathering in tight clusters. Faces showed fear and something else, resignation. This had happened before. A whistle cut through the darkness, high and sharp and too near. Ilara pulled Micah closer, her body curved around his like a shield. His small hand gripped her arm. "Mama?" "Shh, baby, shh." Outside, the community gathered nervously as more whistles echoed from the swamp's edge. The hunters had arrived. The torches moved through the trees like angry fireflies. Ilara counted at least 6, maybe more. The light danced across the water, turning the swamp into a nightmare landscape of shadows and flame. "Get the children inside," Mara hissed. Women scrambled to gather the youngest ones, hands clamping over mouths to stop questions before they started. Ilara couldn't move. Micah lay curled against her chest, his fever making him limp and unresponsive. She'd carried him this far. She wouldn't let them take him now. Her hands trembled as she stroked his hair, feeling the heat radiating from his small body. The hunters emerged from the brush at the settlement's edge. There were 7 of them, big men with rifles slung across their backs and knives on their belts. Their faces were hard, the kind of hardness that came from doing terrible things and calling it work. "We know you're here," one of them shouted. His voice carried across the water, bouncing between the huts. "Come on out. Make this easy." Nobody moved. The settlement held its breath. Another hunter raised his torch higher. "We got dogs! We got time! We'll burn every one of these shacks until you crawl out like the rats you are." Ilara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She pressed her face against Micah's head, breathing in his smell beneath the sickness. Still her baby, still her boy. The hunters began to spread out, forming a loose circle around the huts. They moved with the confidence of men who'd done this before, men who knew fear when they saw it, and how to use it. Then the mist moved wrong. It shifted in a way that had nothing to do with wind. Something large displaced the air, but made no sound doing it. Ilara's eyes strained to see what her instincts were screaming about. 2 shapes stepped out of the darkness between the trees. Men, but not like any men Ilara had ever seen. They stood nearly 7 feet tall, their shoulders broad enough to block the moonlight behind them. Dark skin seemed to absorb the shadows rather than reflect them. They moved with absolute silence despite their size, like they were part of the swamp itself. The hunters saw them. Torches swung around, rifles came up. "What in hell?" one hunter started. The twins, because they had to be twins, identical in their enormousness, didn't speak. One of them, the one on the left, raised his hand and made a sharp gesture. The other responded with a low grunt and a nod. They communicated in a language of movement and sound that needed no words. "You two belong to someone?" a hunter demanded. His voice had gone uncertain. "You got papers?" The twins separated, moving to flank the hunters, still silent, still impossibly quiet for men their size. "I asked you a question, boy." The twin on the right, Yosu, though Ilara wouldn't learn his name until later, moved faster than something that large should be able to move. He crossed the distance to the nearest hunter in 3 long strides. The hunter swung his rifle up, but Yosu simply plucked it from his hands like taking a stick from a child. The hunter stumbled backward and fell into the water with a splash that shattered the tense silence. "Shoot them!" another hunter screamed. 2 rifles fired. The sound cracked across the swamp, making Ilara flinch and pull Micah tighter. But the twins had already moved. They flowed between the shots like water finding gaps in stone. Jonan, the left twin, caught a hunter's arm before he could fire again. He twisted gently, just enough pressure to make the man's fingers open. The rifle dropped into the mud. Jonan shoved the hunter away, sending him sprawling. It wasn't violence exactly. It was control. Perfect, terrifying control. The hunters regrouped, backing toward each other. They'd started with 7. Now they fought like cornered animals, all strategy gone. One pulled a knife and lunged at Yosu. The giant caught his wrist mid-swing, held it there for a moment as if considering, then pushed the hunter backward. The man's feet slipped in the mud. He went down hard, and Yosu placed one enormous foot on his chest, pinning him without crushing him. The hunter with the knife struggled, gasping. Yosu looked down at him with an expression that was neither angry nor pleased, just watchful, waiting for the man to understand. Another hunter tried to run. Jonan stepped into his path, arms crossed. The hunter bounced off him like hitting a wall and sat down hard in the shallow water. "They ain't human," one hunter screamed. "They ain't natural." The twins worked in perfect synchronization. When one moved left, the other moved right. When one disarmed a hunter, the other corralled the next. They drove the men together into a tight group, then simply stood there, blocking every exit. One hunter, braver or more desperate than the others, charged directly at Jonan. The giant waited until the last possible moment, then sidestepped. The hunter's momentum carried him straight into the deeper water. He came up sputtering, covered in mud and moss. Yozu made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite words. Whatever it meant, Jonan understood. He nodded once. Together, they advanced on the remaining hunters. "We're leaving!" the apparent leader shouted. "We're going!" Jonan pointed toward the trees. The gesture was clear. Go. The hunters scrambled. They abandoned their rifles, their torches, their dignity. They fled into the swamp like children running from monsters in the dark. Their voices carried back through the trees, promises that they'd return with more men, with better weapons, with the law itself. But they ran. The settlement slowly emerged from hiding. People stared at the twins with expressions caught between gratitude and fear. These giants had saved them, yes, but what were they? Old Grant stepped forward, limping. "Thank you," he said quietly. The twins didn't respond. Yozu bent to retrieve one of the abandoned rifles. He looked at it for a long moment, then snapped it over his knee like kindling. The sharp crack made several people flinch. "Who are they?" Nadine whispered. Mara stepped up beside Elara. "They live in the deep swamp. They come when—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "They come when they're needed." "They don't talk?" Elara asked. "Not that I've heard." The twins turned as one, facing back toward the deeper darkness. Mist had begun to creep across the water again, curling around their legs. "Wait!" Elara called out. The words escaped before she could stop them. Both giants paused. Jonan turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her but acknowledging she'd spoken. Up close, his face was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 30 years old, with eyes that carried old pain and older caution. "Thank you," she said, "for protecting my son." Jonan's gaze dropped to Micah in her arms, then back to her face. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. Then it was gone. The twins walked back into the swamp. Within moments, the mist swallowed them completely. Elara wasn't even sure which direction they'd gone. Mara began organizing people to gather the children, to check the huts, to salvage what the hunters had dropped. The settlement needed to settle, but Elara stood at the edge of the platform, staring into the darkness where the giants had disappeared. Her arms ached from holding Micah. Her body screamed for rest. Yet she couldn't look away from that wall of mist and shadow. She felt unsettled. Grateful, yes, but unsettled in a way she couldn't name. Those men, if they were just men, had moved like ghosts, fought like soldiers, protected like guardians, all without speaking a single word. Birds sang their morning songs over Hollow Bend. The sound was so ordinary, so peaceful, that Elara woke confused. She'd expected to find herself still running, still listening for dogs in the darkness. Instead, she lay on a thin pallet inside Mara's hut. Weak light filtered through gaps in the walls. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Micah slept beside her, his breathing steady. His leg was swollen, the skin hot to the touch, but he'd made it through the night. That was something. That was more than she'd dared hope for during those long weeks of flight. She sat up carefully, wincing at the protest from her own body. Every muscle ached. Her feet were torn and blistered, but she was alive. Her son was alive. Mara stood near the door, stirring something in a pot over a small fire. She glanced back when she heard Elara move. "You need more sleep," Mara said quietly. "I need to help." Elara pushed herself up. "You've done too much already." "Ain't doing nothing I haven't done before." But Mara didn't argue when Elara came to stand beside her. "Know how to make cornmeal porridge? I can learn." They worked in silence for a while. Outside, Elara could hear other people moving around the settlement. Children's voices, the splash of someone washing clothes in the water. Life continuing despite everything. Those men last night, Elara said finally. She kept her voice low so as not to wake Micah. The big ones. Who are they? Mara's hands stilled over the pot. She was quiet for so long that Elara thought she might not answer. They're Jonan and Josu, Mara said eventually. Twin brothers. Been living in the deep swamp for, must be 3 years now. Where did they come from? Mara's jaw tightened. Same place we all came from. Bondage. Suffering. Men who thought they owned other people's bodies and souls. She ladled porridge into wooden bowls, her movements sharp with old anger. They were sold as a matched pair, she continued. Some rich man up near Savannah wanted spectacle labor. 2 giants to show off to his friends. He paid a fortune for them. Elara felt her stomach turn. What did he make them do? Terrible things. Mara's voice dropped even lower. Exhibitions. Forced them to fight each other for entertainment. Made them lift impossible weights until their bodies broke. Paraded them around like animals at market. She shook her head. Their last owner was a colonel. Herod, I think his name was. He was the worst of them all. What happened? Nobody knows exactly. The colonel hosted some kind of party for plantation owners from all over the state. The twins were supposed to perform. But something went wrong that night. Something snapped. Mara stared into the pot. When morning came, the colonel was found in his study. Alive, but broken. Couldn't walk right anymore. Couldn't talk right. And the twins were gone. Did they? Elara couldn't finish the question. I don't know. The colonel never said what happened. Maybe he couldn't remember. Maybe he was too ashamed to admit it. Either way, he's still alive somewhere, twisted up and bitter. And the twins came here? They came to the swamp, started living out in the deep places where nobody else goes. Every now and then, they appear when the settlement's in danger. They protect us. Then they disappear again. Mara finally looked up at Elara. They don't talk. Whatever was done to them, it sealed their voices shut. Elara thought about the way they'd moved last night. The perfect coordination, the controlled violence. Men who'd learned to survive by becoming weapons. They're still human, Mara added, as if she could hear Elara's thoughts. Still got hearts that bleed. Still got souls worth saving. Don't forget that. The morning passed slowly. Elara fed Micah when he woke, grateful to see him eat even a little. Old Grant came by to check on them. Nadine and Soraya helped distribute food to the other huts. It was nearly midday when the twins appeared again. One moment, the settlement was going about its quiet business. The next, Jonan and Josu stood at the edge of the clearing, having materialized from the swamp without a sound. People noticed them and went still. Not afraid exactly, but cautious, respectful of what they represented. Mara stepped forward. "Morning," she said simply. Jonan nodded once. His eyes scanned the settlement, counting people, checking for damage. Then his gaze settled on Mara's hut. He moved toward it with surprising gentleness for someone his size. Josu followed a half-step behind. Elara stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance instinctively, even though she knew it was pointless. If these men wanted inside, she couldn't stop them. But Jonan stopped several feet away. He pointed at the hut, then made a questioning gesture. "My son," Elara said. "He's sleeping. His leg is broken." Jonan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He held up one massive hand, palm out. "Wait." He stepped closer slowly, telegraphing every movement. Elara's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay still. When he was close enough, Jonan knelt down so he was nearly at her eye level. Up close, she could see scars on his arms, his neck, old wounds that had healed badly. He pointed inside the hut, then at his own leg. Then he made a gesture like snapping a stick. "You want to see his leg?" Elara asked. Jonan nodded. She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Be gentle. He's only 8 years old." The giant moved into the hut with surprising care, ducking low to fit through the entrance. Micah woke when the light was blocked, his eyes going wide at the enormous man kneeling beside his pallet. "Mama?" "It's all right, baby. He wants to help." Jonan examined Micah's leg without touching it at first. His dark eyes tracked the swelling, the angle of the break, the heat of infection. Then he looked at Alara and held up his hands, miming how to splint the leg properly. He demonstrated with such precise gestures that Alara understood immediately. 2 straight branches, strips of cloth wrapped tight, but not too tight. Elevation to reduce the swelling. "I understand," she said. Jonan stood and ducked back outside. He returned moments later with perfectly straight pieces of wood and moss that was somehow still damp and cool. Josu appeared in the doorway, handing his brother long strips of bark that could be softened and used as bindings. Together, without words, they showed Alara how to care for her son's injury. When they finished, Micah's leg was properly splinted for the first time since the break. The boy looked up at Jonan with something like wonder. "Thank you," Micah whispered. Jonan's hand hovered over the boy's head for a moment, not quite touching. Then he pulled back and stood. Outside, Josu had already begun repairing one of the huts damaged during last night's chaos. He worked with efficient precision, his huge hands somehow delicate enough to weave new thatch into old. The twins stayed for perhaps an hour. They fixed what was broken. They checked on the people. And then, as silently as they'd arrived, they prepared to leave. Alara caught Jonan's eye before he disappeared. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he touched his chest, just over his heart, and nodded once. They vanished into the swamp. Miles away, in a plantation house with white columns and manicured gardens, Archibald Price sat behind an ornate desk. The 7 hunters stood before him, muddy and defeated, hats in their hands. "You let them escape," Price said. His voice was calm, too calm. "It wasn't the runaways, sir," the lead hunter stammered. "There were these 2, these giants in the swamp. They came out of nowhere. Giants." Price leaned back in his chair. "Describe them. 7 feet tall, maybe more, black as coal, moved like ghosts, fought like soldiers, never said a word." Something flickered across Price's face. Recognition and hunger. "Twins?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir." "Identical." Price stood and walked to the window. Outside, his fields stretched to the horizon. Wealth built on backs that broke under the weight of his ambition. "I know those men," he said, "or I knew what they were worth before they vanished." He turned back to the hunters. 3 years ago, they humiliated one of my business associates, cost him his reputation, cost me a valuable partnership. "Sir, we can go back for the runaways." "Forget the runaways." Price's eyes glittered. "I want those twins, alive." The hunters exchanged nervous glances. "Sir, with respect, they ain't normal men. They took us apart like we were children." "Then bring more men. Bring better weapons. Bring whatever you need." Price walked back to his desk and opened a locked drawer. He removed a heavy pouch of coins and dropped it on the desk. "Bring me those giants alive, and I'll pay you triple your normal rate." The lead hunter stared at the pouch. That much money could change a man's life. "What do you want them for?" he asked. Price smiled. It was not a kind expression. "They stole something from me long ago. Their labor, their value, their obedience." He pushed the pouch toward the hunters. "It's time I collected what's owed." The hunters looked at each other. Fear warred with greed. Greed won. "When do we leave?" the lead hunter asked. "Tomorrow night," Price said, "and this time, don't come back without them." Morning came to Hollow Bend, with mist curling between the cypress trees. The sun broke through in thin shafts, turning the water silver and gold. Birds called to each other across the swamp. The settlement tried to pretend the previous night hadn't happened. Women hung wet clothes on branches to dry. Men repaired fishing nets and checked traps. Children chased each other between the huts, their laughter high and bright. But everyone moved a little faster than usual. Everyone glanced toward the tree line a little too often. Ilara helped Mara prepare cornmeal mush over the cook fire. Her hands worked mechanically, stirring the pot while her mind wandered elsewhere. Micah sat nearby on a blanket, his splinted legs stretched out before him. He was drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "Mama," he said quietly, "are the bad men coming back?" Ilara's hand paused mid-stir. She looked at her son. 8 years old, and already he'd learned to fear the sound of dogs in the distance. "I don't know, baby." "The giants will protect us," Micah said, with the certainty only children possess. "They're strong." "They are," Ilara agreed, "but they're still just men." Old Grant approached the fire, leaning heavily on a walking stick someone had fashioned for him. His face was drawn, his breathing labored, but his eyes were sharp. "Talk is spreading," he said without preamble. "People are scared. Some want to run deeper into the swamp. Others want to head north tonight while we still can." "We just got here," Ilara said. "Exactly why some want to leave. They think we brought the hunters down on everyone." Grant lowered himself onto a log near the fire. "Can't say I blame them." Mara shook her head. "The hunters would have found Hollow Bend eventually. We all knew that when we came here. Knowing it and living it are different things," Grant replied. Movement at the edge of the settlement made them all turn. Jonan and Josu emerged from the swamp, water dripping from their clothes. They'd been gone since before dawn. Now they walked toward the center of the settlement with purpose. People gathered without being called. Something in the twins' posture told everyone this was important. Mara stood. "What did you find?" Jonan pointed west, then held up fingers. 7. He made a walking gesture, then pointed at the ground. "Coming here." "7 men?" Mara asked. Jonan nodded. Then he pointed at his own eyes and made a sweeping gesture. "They're watching." Josu stepped forward and gestured more urgently. He pointed at everyone gathered, then made a scattering motion with his hands. "Leave. Go different directions." But Jonan grabbed his brother's wrist and pulled it down. He shook his head firmly. Josu yanked his arm free and gestured again, more insistently. He pointed at the children, at the elderly, at Micah's splinted leg. He made the scattering gesture again. "Run while there's time." Jonan stepped between his brother and the crowd. He pointed at the swamp's depths, then made a gesture like pushing dominoes. He pointed at Hollow Bend, then drew a line in the dirt. "Stand here." Ilara understood. "If we scatter, the hunters will track us. They'll find others hiding deeper in the swamp. People who can't fight. People who can't run." Jonan nodded at her, something like relief in his eyes. "But if we stay," a man named Tobias said, "we're putting everyone here in danger. Women, children, people who can barely walk." Josu pointed at Tobias and nodded vigorously. "Exactly." The brothers faced each other. The tension between them was thick enough to cut. Jonan's jaw was set, his shoulders squared. Josu's hands kept moving, gesturing toward the forest, toward freedom, toward escape. Jonan grabbed his brother's shoulders and forced Josu to look at him. He pointed at his own chest, then at Josu's. "Brothers." Then he pointed at everyone gathered. "Family." He shook his head firmly. "No more running." Josu pulled away. He made a sharp gesture like breaking something in half. Then he turned his back on the crowd and walked toward the tree line. Jonan watched him go, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Finally, Mara spoke. "We need to decide. Together." "I say we fight," Ilara said. The words came out before she'd fully thought them through. But once spoken, she didn't take them back. "I'm tired of running. My boy can't run. Old Grant can't run. If we scatter, we die alone in the woods. If we stay, at least we die together. Or we live together," Nadine added quietly. She'd been silent until now. We got lucky last night. The twins saved us. Maybe we can learn from them." Tobias shook his head. "You want to fight trained hunters with sticks and desperation? Better than being hunted like animals until we drop from exhaustion," Soraya said. The argument built, voices rising. Some wanted to flee. Others wanted to stand. Fear made everyone speak louder than necessary. Jonan raised one massive hand. The gesture was simple, but everyone fell silent. He pointed at himself, then made a teaching gesture. He pointed at the swamp, at the trees, at the water. He made symbols in the dirt, lines of defense, places to hide, signals to use. "He's offering to teach us," Mara said slowly. "How to use the swamp to fight back." Jonan nodded. "And what happens when you leave?" Tobias demanded. "When you disappear back into the mist, like you always do? What happens to us then?" Jonan met the man's eyes. He placed his hand over his heart and held it there. Then he pointed at the settlement, at the people, at Micah. "He's saying he'll stay," Elara whispered. Jonan nodded once, firmly. The commitment hung in the air. This was different from protecting them once and vanishing. This was choosing to stand with them, to be part of the community instead of its ghost. Slowly, people began to agree. Not everyone, but enough. Jonan moved through the settlement, showing them what to do. He demonstrated how to read the swamp water for approaching footsteps, how to arrange branches to create false paths, how to whistle bird calls that meant danger or safety, where to hide children in hollow logs that stayed dry, even when the water rose. He was patient, methodical. He repeated every lesson until people understood. But Josu remained at the tree line, watching, refusing to participate. The distance between the brothers grew with every passing hour. By midday, Hollow Bend looked different. Not safer exactly, but more prepared. People moved with purpose now instead of aimless fear. Elara sat outside Mara's hut, adjusting Micah's splint as the afternoon wore on. The moss Jonan had provided kept the swelling down. The boy was resting more comfortably now. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Not as much," Micah said. He was drawing in the dirt again. Stick figures. A mother. A boy. Two giants standing guard. Elara smiled sadly at the picture. Movement caught her eye. Across the settlement, near the edge where swamp met forest, Jonan and Josu stood facing each other. She couldn't hear them, but their body language screamed argument. Yosu's gestures were sharp, aggressive. He kept pointing away from the settlement, his whole body angled toward escape. Jonan stood like a wall, immovable. He kept pointing back at Hollow Bend, at the people, refusing to budge. Josu shoved his brother's chest. Jonan didn't move. Josu shoved again, harder. Still, Jonan stood firm. Finally, Josu made a cutting gesture across his throat. Finished. He turned and started walking toward the deep swamp. Jonan grabbed his arm. Josu spun, and for a moment Elara thought they might actually fight. Two giants locked in a struggle neither wanted, but neither could avoid. Then Josu yanked free and kept walking. Jonan stood alone, watching his brother disappear into the mist. The sun began its descent, turning the sky orange and purple. Shadows grew long across Hollow Bend. Elara focused on Micah's splint, tightening the bark bindings just as Jonan had shown her. But her eyes kept drifting to the tree line where the brothers had argued. The division was growing, and somewhere out in the world beyond the swamp, 7 hunters prepared to return with better weapons and worse intentions. The fog came first. It rolled through Hollow Bend like something alive, thick enough to muffle sound and turn familiar shapes into threatening shadows. Elara woke to the smell of it. Damp earth and rotting vegetation mixed with something else she couldn't identify. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Micah. Through the gaps in the hut's walls, she could see nothing but gray. The settlement had vanished into the mist. Something felt wrong. She rose and stepped outside. The fog pressed against her skin, cold and wet. She could barely see 10 feet in any direction. No voices, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the swamp wrapped in white. Then she smelled smoke, not the pleasant scent of cooking fires. This was sharper, meaner, the smell of things burning that weren't meant to burn. A scream shattered the silence. Alara ran toward the sound without thinking. Others emerged from their huts, confused and frightened. The fog made it impossible to tell where the danger was coming from. Orange light bloomed somewhere to the west. Flames licked through the mist, growing brighter. The food storage huts. "Fire!" someone shouted. "The storage is burning!" People ran in every direction. Some toward the flames to save what they could. Others toward the children's sleeping area to gather the young ones. The fog turned everything into chaos. Alara heard dogs barking. Close. Too close. Torches appeared in the mist like angry stars. The hunters had waited for the fog. They'd planned this. A hunter emerged from the white, rifle raised. He wasn't aiming at people. He was watching for something specific. Waiting. "Where are they?" the hunter shouted. "Where are the giants?" Another torch appeared. Another hunter. They spread through the settlement like a disease, setting fire to whatever they could reach. But they didn't grab anyone. Didn't try to capture the escaped slaves. They just kept shouting. "Come out! Come out and face us!" The food storage hut collapsed in a shower of sparks. Months of dried meat and stored vegetables went up in flames. People screamed, trying to salvage anything they could. The heat was tremendous, even through the fog. A child's cry cut through the chaos. Alara spun toward the sound. The children's hut, the smallest building where the youngest slept together for warmth, had caught fire. The flames must have jumped from the storage building. The doorway was blocked by a fallen beam. "They're trapped!" Nadine screamed. She ran toward the burning structure, but the heat drove her back. 3 children inside. Maybe 4. Their voices rose in terror. Jonan appeared from the fog like an avenging spirit. He didn't hesitate, didn't assess the danger. He simply ran straight into the flames. The hunters saw him. "There! There's one of them!" Rifles fired. Bullets tore through the fog. Jonan disappeared into the burning hut as wood cracked and split around him. Time stretched impossibly long. Seconds felt like hours. Alara held her breath, praying to gods she wasn't sure existed. Jonan emerged with a child under each arm and another clinging to his back. His shirt was on fire. He dropped and rolled, crushing the flames against the wet earth while somehow keeping the children safe. Mara ran forward and grabbed the children, pulling them away. Jonan's arms were blistered and raw. He didn't seem to notice. The hunters advanced through the smoke. "One down, 1 to go." A figure crashed through the fog from the opposite direction. Yosu moved with terrible speed, grabbing the nearest hunter and throwing him bodily into the swamp. The man disappeared with a splash and didn't surface. The brothers didn't coordinate, didn't plan. They fought separately, each protecting a different section of the settlement. The division between them showed in every movement. Yosu disarmed 2 hunters with brutal efficiency. Jonan shielded the elderly as they evacuated toward the deep swamp, but they didn't work together, didn't watch each other's backs. A hunter got behind Jonan, raised his rifle, aimed at the giant's spine. Yosu saw it, threw himself forward. The bullet meant for Jonan tore through Yosu's shoulder instead. He went down hard. Jonan spun, saw his brother fall. Something terrible crossed his face. He moved faster than Alara thought possible for a man his size. The hunter who'd fired didn't have time to reload. Jonan picked him up by the throat and hurled him into 3 of his companions. They went down like dominoes. The remaining hunters retreated into the fog. But they didn't flee in terror like last time. They backed away slowly, laughing. "We don't want the slaves!" one of them shouted. His voice echoed through the settlement. "You hear that? We don't want the runaways!" Another hunter took up the chant. "We want the giants! Just the giants!" "You can keep your miserable swamp," a third voice called. "We're coming back for them. Just them." Their laughter faded into the fog. The dogs' barking grew distant. The torches disappeared one by one. Dawn began to break, turning the fog from gray to pale gold. The smoke from the ruined huts mixed with the mist, creating a haze that burned the eyes and throat. Josu sat on the ground, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Jonan knelt beside him, trying to examine the wound. Josu pushed him away roughly, pointed at himself, then at the tree line. "Leave." Jonan grabbed his brother's wrist, shook his head. "No." Josu tried to stand, but the blood loss made him dizzy. Jonan caught him, held him steady despite Josu's resistance. People gathered around the destroyed food storage. Everything was gone. Months of careful preparation reduced to ash and charred wood. Old Grant stood among the ruins, his face hollow with despair. "That was all we had," someone said. "That was supposed to last us through winter." Children cried. The injured moaned. The settlement felt broken in a way the first attack hadn't managed. Elara found Jonan as the sun climbed higher. He sat alone near the ashes of the storage hut. His hands were blistered and raw from pulling children out of the fire. He didn't treat the burns, just stared into the smoking remains. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the guilt she saw carved into every line of his face. But no words came, so she sat beside him in silence, watched the smoke rise into the morning sky, waited for the sun to burn away the fog and reveal the full extent of their losses. The swamp birds began their morning songs. Life continued despite the destruction. But Hollow Bend felt different now, smaller, more fragile. The hunters had made their intentions clear. This wasn't about escaped slaves anymore. This was about pride and obsession and the terrible need to break something that refused to be broken. Jonan's shoulders sagged as the sun rose higher. He didn't move, didn't respond when people walked past, just stared into the ashes until the morning light turned everything gold. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of fog. Hollow Bend lay exposed in the harsh light. Blackened timbers marked where the storage huts had stood. Ash floated on the breeze like gray snow. People moved slowly through the wreckage. Some picked through the ruins, searching for anything salvageable. Others simply stood and stared, faces blank with shock. The smell of smoke clung to everything: clothes, skin, hair. Elara walked through the settlement, assessing the damage. Her practical mind catalogued losses even as her heart sank. 3 months of stored food gone. 2 huts destroyed. 5 people injured, including Josu. The children traumatized. Winter coming in 2 months. She found Mara sitting outside her hut, sorting through a basket of charred vegetables. Most were ruined. A few might still be edible if they cut away the burned parts. "We won't last a month," Mara said quietly. "Not without those stores." Elara looked at the gathered crowd. Defeated faces, slumped shoulders. The hunters had accomplished something worse than capture. They'd stolen hope. She thought of Micah sleeping peacefully despite his injury. Thought of Nadine learning to laugh again after months of terror. Thought of old Grant teaching children their letters in the dirt. All of it threatened by hunger and despair. No, not like this. Elara stood, raised her voice. "Everyone, gather at the clearing." People looked up, confused, but they came. Slowly at first, then faster. They assembled in the central space where meetings were held. 37 people, some barely more than children. Others bent with age, all of them exhausted and afraid. Elara faced them. The hunters burned our winter stores. They hurt our people. They want us to feel helpless." She paused, letting the words settle. "But we're not helpless. We're here. We're alive. And we're together." "What good is being together if we starve?" someone called out. "We won't starve." Ilara pointed toward the swamp. "There's fish in these waters, roots in this soil, game in these woods. We survived before we had stores. We'll survive now." "That food took months to gather," Old Grant said. His voice cracked with grief. "We can't replace it in time. So we don't replace it." Ilara gestured to the children. "We change how we think about winter. No more storing everything in one place. We build smaller caches, hide them across the swamp. Make the hunters work for every scrap they try to burn." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not quite agreement, but not hopelessness either. Something shifting. Nadine stood. "I can fish. Soraya can too. We'll bring in what we catch daily." "I know which routes are safe," a woman named Clara offered. "Which ones keep in mud pits underground." "I can hunt small game," a young man added. "Set snares away from the settlement." One by one, people offered skills, knowledge, strength. The community began to knit itself back together through shared purpose. Ilara organized them into groups: fishers, foragers, builders to reconstruct what burned, watchers to guard against another attack. She moved among them, assigning tasks based on ability, making sure the elderly had lighter work, and the children stayed useful without being endangered. The twins stood apart, watching. Yosu's shoulder was wrapped in cloth torn from someone's shirt. The bleeding had stopped, but his movements were stiff and painful. Jonan stood beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. Ilara approached them. "We need you." Yosu gestured sharply at himself, then toward the tree line, his meaning clear. "We should leave. The hunters don't want us anymore," Ilara said. "They want you." "That's true." She looked between the brothers. "But leaving won't protect us. It'll just mean the next settlement suffers the same attacks. And the next, until those hunters get what they want." Jonan's jaw tightened. He looked at his brother. "Help us prepare," Ilara continued, "not to hide, to fight back." The twins exchanged a long look. Something passed between them. Years of shared trauma, shared survival, shared silence. Josu's shoulders sagged slightly. He nodded once. Jonan turned to Ilara and gestured toward the marsh. She followed as the twins began to work. Jonan showed her where to dig defensive trenches, narrow channels that would flood quickly, turning solid ground into sucking mud. He demonstrated with his hands how to disguise them with reeds and moss, make them invisible until someone stepped wrong. Yosu, despite his injury, worked on traps along the waterways. He wove together flexible branches and weighted stones, creating tension systems that would flip small boats if triggered. He positioned them at the natural entry points to Hollow Bend, places where the water was deep enough for boats, but narrow enough to control. The community watched, learned, joined in. Children gathered armfuls of reeds for camouflage. Women helped weave the trap mechanisms while Josu directed with gestures and occasional grunts. Men dug the trenches under Jonan's guidance, following patterns that turned Hollow Bend into a maze of hidden dangers. The work took all day. By sunset, the settlement looked unchanged to casual eyes, but everywhere lay carefully concealed defenses. Jonan tested each one personally, his massive weight ensuring they'd hold against anything smaller. Night fell. The community gathered for a sparse meal. Fish caught that afternoon, roots dug that morning. Not much, but enough. They ate together in the clearing, firelight dancing across tired faces. Then they heard it. The splash of oars, muffled voices on the water. The hunters were returning, sooner than expected. Boats moving through the dark marsh, trying to reach Hollow Bend from 3 directions at once. Jonan and Josu moved to opposite sides of the settlement, watching. waiting. The first boat hit Yozu's trap. The mechanism released with a crack. The boat flipped sideways, dumping 2 hunters into the black water. They came up sputtering, thrashing in panic. The second boat tried to avoid the commotion. Jonan appeared from the shadows, grabbed the prow, and lifted. The hunters tumbled backward into the marsh. Their rifles sank immediately. The third boat turned to flee, hit another trap, capsized completely. Villagers rushed forward with poles and ropes, not to capture the hunters, to pull them from the water before they drowned. The swamp was dangerous at night, full of sinkholes and currents that pulled unwary swimmers down. The hunters scrambled onto shore, coughing and humiliated. They'd come to kidnap villagers and instead found themselves rescued by their intended victims. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The hunters ran, left their boats behind, disappeared into the darkness without their weapons or their dignity. Hollow Bend erupted in quiet celebration. No shouting. They couldn't risk attracting more attention. But smiles spread. Backs straightened. The victory was small but real. Someone started singing softly. Others joined in. An old spiritual that spoke of deliverance and rivers crossed. The melody drifted through the swamp, carrying hope. A small girl, maybe 5 years old, approached Jonan. She'd been one of the children he pulled from the burning hut. Her arms were bandaged from minor burns. She looked up at him with wide, solemn eyes. "Are the bad men coming back?" Jonan knelt slowly. For a long moment, he just looked at her. The firelight caught the scars on his arms, the burns from the rescue still raw and painful. Then he spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper, but the words were clear. "We protect our own." The clearing went silent. Everyone stared. Those 3 words carried the weight of years of silence, years of trauma finally breaking under the pressure of community and purpose. The little girl smiled and hugged him. Jonan's huge hands hovered awkwardly before gently patting her back. Yozu watched from across the fire. Something changed in his face, the hard edge softening. He caught his brother's eye and nodded slowly. Agreement, acceptance, unity. The music grew stronger. People moved closer to the fire, sharing body heat as the night grew cold. Children dozed against their mothers. Old Grant hummed along with the singing, his voice cracking but joyful. Alara sat with Micah curled against her side. She pulled a thin blanket over him, tucking it carefully around his splinted leg. For the first time since they'd fled, he slept without nightmares. His breathing was deep and even, peaceful. She looked up at the stars visible through gaps in the swamp canopy, the same stars that had guided them here, the same stars that would guide others still running. Yozu stood at the edge of the firelight. The flames caught his face, highlighting features softened by the first smile anyone had seen him wear. His injured shoulder would heal. The community would endure. They'd found something worth protecting. The night deepened around them. Music drifted through the trees. Hollow Bend held its breath and dared to hope. Pre-dawn mist settled thick across Hollow Bend. The water lay still as glass, reflecting pale sky. The settlement slept hard after the night's celebration, exhausted from work and relief. Ilara woke first. She moved quietly through Mara's hut, checking Micah's forehead for fever. Cool. His breathing steady. She stepped outside into the gray morning. The fire pit held only cold ashes. Someone had banked it properly before sleep. Smart. They couldn't afford to waste fuel. She walked to the water's edge. The swamp stretched away in layers of fog and shadow, beautiful in its own dangerous way. A place that protected them precisely because it threatened everyone equally. Movement caught her eye. Jonan, standing waist-deep in the marsh, checking the traps, making sure last night's victory hadn't damaged the mechanisms, always working, always vigilant. Ilara turned back toward the huts. Let him have his quiet. They'd earned one peaceful morning. The peace lasted until the sun touched the horizon. Torches appeared, too many to count, moving through the swamp from the east, not sneaking this time, marching openly, confidently. "Wake up!" Mara's voice shattered the stillness. "They're coming!" The settlement erupted into chaos. People stumbled from huts, grabbing children, looking for weapons. The careful calm of the night before vanished like morning mist. Jonan waded from the water. Yosu emerged from the tree line where he'd been hunting. The brothers met in the clearing, exchanging rapid gestures, pointing, planning. The torches drew closer. Ilara counted at least 20 men, more than before. They'd brought reinforcements, professional hunters by the look of them, armed with rifles and chains. Then she saw the figure in the center, being carried on a makeshift litter by 4 men. Someone important, someone who didn't walk well on his own. The hunters stopped just outside arrow range. One of them cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Titan! Goliath! Your master calls you home." The names echoed across the water. Performance names, slave names, deliberately chosen to humiliate and dehumanize. Jonan went rigid. His hands stopped mid-gesture. Yosu's entire body tensed like a drawn bowstring. The figure on the litter spoke. His voice carried across the swamp, despite its weakness, rasping and broken, but unmistakable. "Did you think I died, boys? Did you hope?" Colonel Herod twisted sideways in the litter, one leg visibly wrong even from a distance, face scarred on the left side, but alive, very much alive. "Come here." The colonel's voice dripped with false gentleness. "Come home. You know you belong to me." Jonan staggered. Actually staggered. This giant of a man who'd fought hunters and lifted boats stumbled backward like he'd been struck. Yosu made a sound, low and animal, pain given voice. "Look at them," Herod continued. "Still trained, still obedient. You can dress them in swamp mud and call them free, but they know. Deep down, they know." He raised one twisted hand, snapped his fingers. "Titan, kneel." Jonan's knees buckled. He caught himself, straightened with visible effort. But the reflex had been there, years of conditioning forcing his body to respond before his mind could stop it. "Goliath, come forward." Yosu took a step, then another, walking toward the hunters like a man in a dream. His eyes were wide and blank, seeing something no one else could see. "No!" Ilara ran forward, grabbed Yosu's arm. He didn't seem to notice her, just kept walking. The hunters moved fast. They'd been waiting for this. 3 of them rushed forward with a net. Heavy rope weighted with stones. They threw it over Yosu's head and pulled. He went down hard, still not fighting, still lost in whatever memory had swallowed him. Jonan roared. The sound was inhuman. Rage and grief and terror combined. He charged toward the hunters, but more of them appeared from the sides. They'd planned this carefully. Set an ambush within the ambush. 4 men with tranquilizer darts, the kind used on dangerous animals, stepped from behind trees. The darts hit Yosu in rapid succession. 4 impacts. He tried to rise, tangled in the net. Fell. His eyes found Jonan. Tried to signal something. Failed. His face went slack. "Take him!" Herod's voice was triumphant. "Leave the other one! Let him think about what happens to runaways." The hunters hauled Yosu away. His massive body dragged across the mud. Unconscious, helpless. Jonan ran after them, made it maybe 30 feet before his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees in the marsh water, shaking. His mouth worked, but no sound emerged. The voice he'd just found the night before had disappeared back into trauma. The hunters vanished into the tree line, taking Yosu with them, taking the torches, leaving only silence and fog. Hollow Bend stood frozen. No one knew what to do. Their guardians, their giants, had been broken without a single blow being struck. Just words. Just the presence of the man who'd once owned them. Ilara ran to Jonan. He knelt in the water, hands pressed against the mud, whole body trembling. She touched his shoulder. He flinched away violently. "Jonan, look at me." He wouldn't. Couldn't. His breathing came in short gasps. Panic attack. She'd seen them before in people who'd escaped. Sometimes the body remembered trauma. The mind tried to forget. "We'll get him back. We'll—" Jonan stood abruptly, walked away from her, from everyone. He moved like a ghost, like something already dead. Mara tried to approach him with food at midday. He turned his back, refused to eat, refused to acknowledge her presence. Old Grant attempted to talk strategy. Jonan walked away mid-sentence. Children brought him water. He let it sit untouched. The settlement spiraled into fear. Without both twins, the defenses meant nothing. The hunters could return whenever they wanted, take whoever they wanted. Hollow Bend's brief moment of hope crumbled like wet clay. Ilara found Jonan as afternoon gave way to evening. Rain had started falling, soft at first, then harder. Thunder rumbled in the distance. He sat under a leaning cypress tree at the water's edge. Rain dripped from his hair, ran down his face. He stared at nothing, seeing everything that had happened, everything he'd failed to prevent. "The community needs you," Ilara spoke quietly, firmly. "Your brother needs you." No response, not even acknowledgement she'd spoken. "Jonan, look at me." Nothing. His eyes remained fixed on some point across the water. Empty. The man who'd said, "We protect our own," was gone, replaced by whatever the colonel's voice had summoned from the past. Thunder rolled louder. The rain intensified. Ilara stood there getting soaked, trying to reach someone who'd already drowned. Finally, she turned away, left him sitting under the cypress, alone with his memories and his failure. The rain fell harder. Hollow Bend huddled in their huts, listening to water drum against crude roofs, wondering if the hunters would come back tonight, wondering if they'd survive without their guardians. Jonan sat motionless, rain streaming from his hair, his massive shoulders hunched, staring into nothing as the storm grew and the light failed and hope bled away into the hungry swamp. Dawn broke gray and cold over Hollow Bend. The storm had passed, but left everything soaked. Water dripped from every leaf and branch. The ground had turned to soup. People moved through mud that sucked at their feet with each step. Ilara hadn't slept. She'd spent the night listening to rain and thinking about Yosu, about the blank look in his eyes as they dragged him away, about Jonan sitting alone in the storm like a man waiting to die. She found him exactly where she'd left him, still under the cypress tree, still staring at nothing. Rain had stopped, but he remained drenched. His clothes stuck to his massive frame. His hands lay open on his knees like he'd forgotten how to make fists. Ilara walked through the mud and stood in front of him, blocking his view of whatever he was seeing that wasn't really there. "Get up!" No response. His eyes didn't even shift to acknowledge her. "I said get up, Jonan." Still nothing, like talking to stone. She crouched down, put herself at his eye level, forced him to either look at her or actively look away. "Your brother is alive. They took him alive because they want leverage. They want you to break, to give up. And you're doing exactly what they expect." His jaw tightened, first sign of life she'd seen. "You think you failed him?" She kept her voice hard. No sympathy, no comfort. "You did. You froze. You let trauma control you. And now Josu is in chains because you couldn't fight through your fear." Jonan flinched. "Good. Better anger than emptiness. But you can sit here drowning in guilt. Or you can stand up and fix it." She grabbed his face with both hands, forced him to meet her eyes. "You survived Masters before. You survived that colonel. You survived every degradation they put you through. For what? To hide in a swamp? To let them win anyway? His breathing quickened. Pain flickered across his features. You survived for them then. Her voice dropped lower, harder. Now you survive for us, for Josu, for Micah, for everyone in this settlement who believed you were more than what they made you. Jonan's eyes finally focused on her face, really seeing her. She watched something crack behind those eyes, some dam he'd built to hold everything back. His face crumpled. This enormous man who'd fought off hunters without flinching began to shake. His shoulders heaved. No sound came out at first, just silent, wrenching sobs that made his whole body convulse. Elara didn't let go, held his face as he broke. Let him feel it. All of it. The terror and shame and rage he'd been burying since the colonel's voice had torn open old wounds. Finally sound came. A low moan. Grief-given voice. He bent forward until his forehead pressed against her shoulder, trembling like a child, mourning everything that had been taken, everything he'd lost, everything he'd never been allowed to feel. She held him. This giant, reduced to pieces, let him shake and sob and finally release what he'd been carrying alone. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually the trembling slowed. His breathing steadied. He pulled back, wiping his face with muddy hands. His eyes were red but clearer, present. They have him in the old hunting camp. His voice came out rough, unused, but it came. 3 miles northeast, island with solid ground. The colonel used it before. When we... He stopped, swallowed hard, continued. Dry land, surrounded by water. Easy to defend. Hard to approach without being seen. He stood slowly, testing his legs, finding his strength again. He'll keep Josu drugged, chained. Make an example of him to draw me in. Then we don't give him what he expects. Elara stood too. We don't send you alone into his trap. We send everyone. Jonan looked at her. Really looked. Something shifted in his expression. Understanding. Maybe even hope. The traps we built. The paths we mapped. The signals. He spoke faster now. Mind working again. We know this swamp better than they do. We've been learning it for weeks. And they're expecting you to come broken. Desperate. Elara felt her own hope rising. Not leading an army. Not an army. Jonan's voice grew steadier. A community. People who choose to fight. They walked back to the settlement together. People emerged from huts when they saw Jonan upright again, walking with purpose. The shift in mood was immediate. Mara brought food without being asked. This time, Jonan ate, standing in the center of the clearing while others gathered around him. Old Grant approached, nodded approval. Tell us the plan, son. Jonan looked around at the faces watching him. Children and elders. Mothers and young men who'd never held a weapon before this place taught them. People who'd chosen to stay and fight instead of running deeper into the swamp. He began to speak, describing the hunting camp's layout from memory, where guards would stand, how they'd use torches for light, the blind spots in their defenses. His voice grew stronger with each detail, each piece of knowledge pulled from years of forced observation, learning to read environments because his survival had depended on it. We move after dark. He pointed to 3 young men who'd proven quick and quiet during the previous attacks. You 3 approach from the west. Make noise. Draw their attention. Make them think we're coming with force. He gestured to Mara and 2 other women. You circle south. Quiet. Slow. Get close to where they're keeping Josu. Wait for my signal. Old Grant stepped forward without being asked. I'll lead the decoy group. These old bones can still make a ruckus when needed. One by one, people volunteered, assigned themselves roles, offered skills. The settlement transformed from frightened refugees into something else, something unified and dangerous. Elara watched Jonan coordinate them, saw him becoming what the community needed. not a guardian who protected from the shadows, a leader who stood among them. The day passed in preparation, checking weapons, reviewing routes, practicing signals in case voices couldn't carry. Children were assigned to elders who would stay behind, creating a final defensive line if everything went wrong. As sun dropped toward the horizon, Jonan stood at the water's edge. Others gathered behind him. Torches were lit. Fire reflected on dark water. The swamp stretched away into growing shadows. He looked back at the faces behind him. People who'd chosen this fight, who could have fled but stayed, who trusted him despite watching him break. His voice when he spoke was low, but carried clearly, firm, certain. "We move." Moonlight barely touched the water. Clouds drifted across the sky, throwing shadows that moved and shifted. Perfect cover. Hollow Bend's boats slipped into the swamp without sound. 3 people per vessel, packed tight. Paddles moving slow through black water. Jonan rowed in the lead boat with Ilara and Mara. He watched the water, reading ripples, spotting submerged logs before they struck. Behind them, 5 more boats followed in silence. Each person knew their role. Each movement had been rehearsed during the long afternoon. They'd left the children with the eldest members of the settlement, created barriers of sharpened stakes around the huts. If this failed, Hollow Bend would make its last stand there. But failure wasn't something Jonan allowed himself to consider now. His mind held only the plan, only the next step. The water grew shallower as they approached the hunting camp's island. Jonan raised a fist. Boats stopped moving. They'd reached the point where they needed to separate. He gestured left, right, forward. Groups peeled away into darkness, vanishing between cypress trunks and hanging moss. Old Grant's decoy team moved west. Jonan watched them disappear, counted slowly in his head, giving them time to get into position. The silence pressed against his ears. Nothing but water dripping, frogs calling, mosquitoes humming near his face. Then, noise. Distant but distinct. Branches snapping. Voices shouting. Old Grant's group making themselves heard, making themselves seen, drawing attention exactly as planned. Torchlight flared on the island ahead. Hunters scrambling, dogs barking. Jonan heard the colonel's voice cutting through the chaos, sharp and commanding, directing men toward the western approach. Jonan moved. 3 others followed him through knee-deep water. No splashing. Each foot placed carefully, testing mud before committing weight. They wore dark clothing, faces smeared with wet earth. Invisible against black water and darker trees, the island's eastern shore came into view. A beached boat. 2 guards standing watch, but turned away, focused on the western commotion. Jonan signaled. His companions spread out, circling the guards from behind. A whistle, their agreed signal, and both guards dropped. Not killed. Drugged rags pressed over mouths, bodies caught before they fell, dragged into shadow, tied with strips of cloth, gagged. They'd wake tomorrow with headaches and shame. Jonan climbed onto solid ground, found the path he remembered. The colonel never changed his methods, always kept prisoners in the same place. Center of camp. Maximum visibility. Maximum control. Torches burned in a rough circle ahead. Jonan crept to the edge of light, staying low, peering between tents and supply crates. There, center of the clearing, Yozu, chained to a thick post driven deep into earth, arms pulled behind him, ankles shackled, head hanging forward. Bruises darkened his face. Blood dried at the corner of his mouth, but his chest rose and fell. Alive. 3 hunters stood guard nearby, rifles ready, eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for Jonan to rush in blindly, waiting for grief to make him stupid. But Jonan had learned patience in darker places than this. He circled the camp's perimeter, counted men, noted positions. The colonel stood near a large tent, barking orders. Most hunters had run toward the decoy noise. Maybe 15 men remained, too many for direct assault. But direct assault was never the plan. Mara's group signaled from the south. 3 soft bird calls. They were in position. Jonan returned the signal, then gave the order. Chaos erupted from multiple directions at once. Traps they'd planted hours earlier, hidden in approach paths, covered with leaves and mud, sprang closed. Rope snares, pitfalls, sharpened stakes angled to wound legs. Screams cut through the night as hunters discovered Hollow Bend had been preparing this ground all afternoon while the colonel thought himself safe. The 3 guards near Josu turned toward the noise. Jonan moved, fast and silent. First guard went down from a strike to the back of his head. Second turned too late. Jonan's hand closed over his throat, squeezed until consciousness fled. Third raised his rifle, but Mara appeared from shadow, swinging a heavy branch. The rifle clattered away. Jonan dropped to his knees beside Josu, pulled lockpicks from his pocket. Thin pieces of metal he'd shaped from old tools. His hands shook as he worked the shackles. Years of muscle memory guiding fingers through mechanical patterns. "Brother." His voice cracked. "Josu, I'm here." Yosu's head lifted slowly, eyes unfocused. Drugged but aware enough to recognize the voice. His mouth moved. No sound came out, but Jonan read the shape of his lips. "Knew you'd come." The shackles clicked open. Josu slumped forward. Jonan caught him, held his twin's weight easily despite the size, felt the trembling in Josu's muscles, the shallow breathing. The damage done. "Can you walk?" Josu nodded, pushed himself upright with Jonan's help, swayed, but stayed standing. His hands found Jonan's shoulders, squeezed. Communication beyond words, gratitude, relief, brotherhood that ran deeper than blood. Touching. The colonel's voice cut through the darkness, cold, mocking. The monsters reunited. Both twins turned. The colonel emerged from his tent, leaning heavily on a cane. His left side twisted from old injuries, the damage they'd done to him before escaping years ago. But his eyes burned with the same cruel intelligence, the same need to dominate. "Did you think you'd won?" He moved closer, limping but unafraid. "Did you think escaping me meant freedom? You belong to me. Always have. Always will." He spoke the old commands, words that had once controlled them completely, performance names that stripped away humanity, orders that had made them dance like trained animals for wealthy audiences. The twins stood motionless. The colonel smiled, thinking silence meant obedience, thinking trauma still owned them. Then Jonan stepped forward. Just one step, but it shattered the colonel's smile. "No." One word, simple, final. The colonel's face twisted. "You dare?" "You have no power here." Josu's voice joined his brother's, rough from disuse and drugs, but steady. "Not anymore." They moved together, not attacking, just walking forward. The colonel stumbled backward. His cane slipped in mud. Fear cracked through his expression. Raw and ugly. The same fear he'd forced into others for decades. "Kill me then!" He shouted it, desperate. "Prove you're the monsters I said you were." Jonan shook his head, reached down and took the colonel's cane, snapped it across his knee. "Let the pieces fall. We're not monsters." His voice carried across the clearing. "We're men, and we choose mercy." He gestured to Mara. She stepped forward with rope. They bound the colonel's hands, not tight enough to cut circulation, not loose enough to escape. Then Jonan removed the colonel's boots, his coat, his hat, left him in thin shirt and trousers. "What are you doing?" The colonel's voice climbed higher, panic setting in. "Giving you what you gave us." Josu spoke quietly. Fear, helplessness, the choice to survive or surrender. They left him there, standing in the center of his camp, bound and barefoot, night deepening around him, swamp sounds growing louder, dogs howling in the distance. His own hunters scattered and fleeing. No weapons, no protection, just darkness, and whatever moved through it. His screams followed them as they left, begging, cursing, calling their old names, promising revenge, promising forgiveness, promising anything. The twins didn't look back. They moved through water with the others, helping wounded villagers, collecting scattered weapons, following the paths back to Hollow Bend. The colonel's voice faded behind them, swallowed by distance and swamp. Dawn broke slowly, gray light filtering through moss and branches. The boats reached Hollow Bend's shore as birds began singing. People emerged from huts. Children ran to greet them. Old Grant counted heads. Everyone accounted for. Some injuries, but nothing fatal. Jonan and Josu stood together at the water's edge, watching the swamp behind them, listening to silence where screaming had been. The colonel's fate was his own now. Nature would decide. Fear would decide. The same forces he'd used as weapons against others. Elara approached, carried water and clean cloth, tended Josu's wounds without speaking, understanding that words weren't needed, that the twins had crossed some threshold tonight, had chosen something harder than revenge, had chosen to remain human despite every reason to become the monsters they'd been called. The swamp settled into mourning peace. Whatever happened to the colonel would happen far from here, hidden in places where twisted men met consequences, where the powerless finally held power, where old debts were paid in full. Sunrise came gentle, orange light touching cypress tops first, then spreading down through branches, warming mist that rose from dark water. The air smelled clean, rain-washed, new. Hollow Bend woke slowly, doors creaking open, voices calling soft greetings, children emerging barefoot to splash in puddles left from the storm. The settlement looked different in morning light, smaller than it seemed during night's terror, more fragile, but standing. Yonan sat outside Mara's hut, back against rough wood, watching the community come alive. His body ached from yesterday's fight. Bruises darkened his ribs where a hunter's club had connected. His knuckles were scraped raw, but the pain felt distant, manageable, real in a way that proved he'd survived. Josu emerged from the hut, moving slower than usual, limping slightly from the shackle's damage. He lowered himself beside his brother. They sat in silence for a while, shoulders touching, breathing matched without effort. Feels different now. Josu's voice was rough. Still recovering from days of forced silence and drugs, Jonan nodded, knew exactly what his twin meant. The swamp felt different. The settlement felt different. They felt different. Something had shifted during the night. Some weight they'd carried for years had finally been set down. We stayed. Jonan spoke quietly. Could have run. Could have disappeared like before. Yeah. Josu watched a child chase a frog through shallow water. But running doesn't end things, just delays them. Movement across the clearing caught their attention, Elara helping Micah walk. The boy's leg was still splinted, but healing well. He put more weight on it each day. His face showed less pain, more hope. He waved when he spotted the twins. They waved back. Come on. Jonan stood, extended a hand to his brother. Work to do. The community had already begun organizing. Old Grant directed efforts from the center of camp, pointing to damaged structures, assigning tasks based on ability. His voice carried authority earned through age and wisdom. People listened without argument. The twins approached. Grant studied them both, taking in their injuries, their exhaustion, then nodded approval. Glad you're back. Need those hands of yours. Where do you want us? Jonan asked. Roofing crew needs help. Grant gestured toward a hut with fire-damaged thatch. Josu, you know construction better than most. Get that sorted. Josu moved toward the hut. 3 others were already there, pulling down ruined thatch, setting aside wood that could be salvaged. They made space for him without speaking, handed him tools, let him work at his own pace. Grant turned to Jonan. "And you? Got some youngsters who need teaching. Survival skills, tracking, navigation, things that keep people alive out here." Jonan hesitated. Teaching meant talking, meant trusting his voice wouldn't fail, meant believing children would listen to words coming from someone like him. "They'll listen." Grant seemed to read his thoughts. "You saved half this camp last night. They respect you. Time you started respecting yourself." 4 children waited near the edge of camp. 2 girls and 2 boys, ages ranging from maybe 7 to 12. They watched Jonan approach with wide eyes. Not fear exactly, more like awe. "Morning." His voice came out steadier than expected. "Morning, sir." The oldest girl spoke first. Others echoed her. "Not sir, just Jonan." He knelt to their level. "Grant says you want to learn tracking." Enthusiastic nodding. The youngest boy stepped closer. "Can you teach us to move quiet, like you did last night?" "That's advanced." Jonan smiled slightly. "Start with basics first. Reading signs, understanding what you see." He led them into the trees, pointed out marks in mud, deer tracks, rabbit trails, broken twigs that showed direction of travel. The children absorbed everything, asked questions, touched prints carefully, like they held some sacred knowledge. "Now, look up." Jonan gestured to the canopy. "Trees tell stories too. Moss grows thicker on north-facing trunks. Birds nest in certain patterns. Everything connects." The oldest girl studied branches overhead. "How do you remember all this?" "Practice." He kept his answer simple. Didn't mention years of forced labor that taught him to notice everything, to read environments for any advantage, and necessity. When you need something to survive, you learn it deep. They moved deeper into the woods. Jonan showed them how to step without snapping branches, how to test ground before committing weight, how to listen for changes in bird calls that meant danger approaching, skills he'd learned through pain, through desperation, now offered freely to children who might never need them, but should know them anyway. Back at camp, Yosu worked with focused intensity. His hands moved with precision despite their size, weaving new thatch, securing beams. The other workers matched his pace, learning his techniques. The hut's roof took shape quickly. Better than before, stronger. Midday brought shared food. Simple fare, but plentiful. The community gathered in loose groups, eating and talking and laughing. Normal sounds, human sounds, the kind that happened when people felt safe. Ilara sat beside Micah, unwrapping his splint to check progress. The swelling had decreased significantly. Bone fragments were aligning properly. Another few weeks and he'd walk without help. "It doesn't hurt as much anymore." Micah watched her work. "Think I'll run again?" "I think you'll do whatever you set your mind to." She rewrapped the splint carefully. "Your body is healing. Give it time." Mara approached with fresh bandages, sat down to help. "Heard you were tending others yesterday." "During the fighting." Ilara shrugged. "Did what needed doing?" "Everyone did." "Still." Mara's tone carried respect. "You kept people together when things got dark." "That matters." Afternoon brought more work. Old Grant supervised construction of a new storehouse, larger than before, better positioned. He'd learned from past mistakes, planned for future threats. The structure rose steadily, community members working together, passing tools, sharing techniques, building something that belonged to everyone. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.